get started and talk about some background, and then go through the present the syllogism and the three figures in a little bit of a scholastic manner, and then move on to the Ilyenkov article as a bridge between Aristotle and Hegel, or as an introduction to Hegel, if you will. And then I have a nice summary of Aristotle's logic from Heidegger, which I'd like to read. It's only going to take 5 minutes, but it's Heidegger, so it's worth sharing. Okay. So I think this is our 6th meeting, which means there are 2 more meetings, and I propose we have our 7th meeting after the new year. We'll send you the correct, precise, specific dates. It's probably going to be January 22nd or thereabouts for our next meeting after today.
Oh, we have a meeting after today?
Well, this is only our 6th meeting, and there are 8 total. So
when is the next meeting?
It's going to be in late January, like January 20. Are you going to be here?
No, I leave on the 11th. I'll be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Until early February.
I come back the 18th of February. I go from the 11th of January to the 18th of February.
You'll have access to the video lecture. Well, everything is recorded. And then you'll come back just in time for part 2 of the class, which will be a continuation starting from Hegel.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is.
I will attend. Send me emails.
Yeah. We will totally keep you in the loop. We'll send you emails, everything.
I'll have it all that.
Yeah.
But I gotta do that Harvey thing so I get Das Kapital in my head better.
Those are useful, definitely. Yeah.
Al will kill me if I take that alone to study on the vacation.
It's better to read a novel, right? So our 7th meeting will be sometime. Hey, Phil. Our 7th meeting will be sometime in January. We'll send an email, and it'll be announced on the website. So in terms of the readings, for the first hour, I propose we do like a scholastic presentation of the syllogism from last time, just to finish Aristotle in this sense, so we have a basic framework, and then engage with the Ilyenkov article about the school. Our school must teach how to think. Which means that the actual discussion of Hegel's syllogism will be reserved for next class, which is fine, because part 2 of this class will be, which will start at late January, will begin with Hegel, probably at least 3 or 4
Are you going to do it on Wednesday again?
I don't know. Are we
Yeah, Wednesday.
Probably.
Wednesday will be our Wednesday evening. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, nothing is set in stone yet, but right?
Yeah, that's the one date that is, I had to cancel all kinds of things this time. That's the one date that everything is scheduled.
Well, the problem, Mondays are very difficult
Doing a show in February,
because of the parent-teacher meetings here.
Wednesday and Tuesday.
So Wednesday's kind of the best days to schedule a continuity
How many people
at the school.
Can do a Wednesday. Like for how many people Wednesdays are okay?
I just can't do it in February.
February, but otherwise it's okay
Otherwise
for you.
it's okay.
Not great for you.
I can't.
Good for me.
I really
Good for you.
can't.
So maybe
We'll
February,
watch a
but then
video.
March.
Yeah.
Will, this is going to go on for 15 years, so it's okay.
Yeah.
So next semester is going to be basically Hegel's syllogism, and then the David L. Harvey article, which is kind of a great article. It's a long article. That's at least 2 sessions by itself, and then Marx those chapters from volume 2, and then more Ilyenkov, and I have some other interesting proposals. If we like Ilyenkov, there's a great article by a friend of Ilyenkov's by the name of Bibler, who wrote a great anti-positivist text, The Anti-Popper, a deconstruction of how Karl Popper didn't really understand dialectics because he never really understood or studied Hegel seriously. Like paragraph by paragraph deconstruction of how Karl Popper's article, What is Dialectics, is basically garbage.
And I would suggest alongside that parallel, don't have to read it here, but if people are interested, Marcuse, wrote on Popper called The Poverty of Historicism.
The poverty of historicism.
Right,
Yeah,
very,
we can do
very
that
good.
as well.
From Luther to Popper in terms of a moment against positivism,
Yeah.
as your friend Bieber and also Marcuse against historicism.
That would be a good
Right.
thing to read together with.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of good stuff for next time,
Right.
for next semester as well. Okay, so we can start with the presentation, just with the Aristotle syllogism. And we ended, I believe last time, structure of the categorical proposition. Now I just want to present the minor, major premises and the terms, and then we can do the three figures of the syllogism, and then that's enough as an initial presentation. And then we can move on to the Ilyenkov. But I do have, I want to read to you Heidegger's introduction to his 1934 summer lecture course at the University of Freiburg,
Right.
entitled Logic as the Question Concerning the Essence of Language. And the opening lecture has a profound summary in 2 pages of Aristotle's logic. And I just want to read you this, so if that's okay, just to bear with me for 5 minutes. It's a beautiful section, Heidegger's introduction to his lectures, where he says, the title logic is the abbreviation of the Greek expression, I can't say it. This expression means concerning the logos, right? So logic is essentially the study of the logos. One should add, in this sense, logic is the knowledge that concerns the logos. Logic means the knowing well of the logos. Yet logos in general means saying and talking, that is, saying and talking in a particular meaning, conceived in a distinctive sense, namely as the logos apophantikos. This is why Aristotle focuses on the sentence, right? This is why the categorical syllogism focuses on spoken and written language, right? Because this is how humans make sense of the world, and this is why Heidegger is basically repeating this. Logic is essentially understanding well the logos, but what is logos? Logos in general sense means to talk and to say, right? So logic essentially has to do with talking, speaking, writing, having a conversation, right? And how do we do that well? Speaking well, conveying meanings in ways through which humans convey meanings well. And what are the structures that we can discern of speaking and talking in a well-formed fashion? This is that saying that has in itself the performance and the tendency of showing, of pointing out. So what does it mean to talk? To talk and to say, it means to show, to point things out. Okay, so this is sort of Heidegger's fleshing out of Aristotle's categories, if you will, and the prior analytic. In the logos, that shows and points out lies the essence of the proposition. So what is the proposition? The proposition exposes, it's a performance, right? It uses that word. The proposition is a particular kind of talking, in distinction from talk in the sense of commanding, demanding, asking, praising, proposing, and scolding. So proposition, the proposition that emerges when we use it in our spoken and written language, is a specific kind of communicating, of talking, right? In distinction to other kinds of talking that humans engage in, some examples of which might be commanding, demanding, asking, right? Okay, the propositional logos says how a thing is and what the matter is. You can't get clearer than Heidegger, I think. You just can't do it.
Except politically.
Except politically, writing in 1934.
Clear in thought, but not in action.
However, in Heidegger's defense as one of the fundamental thinkers of the last 500 years, at least, Heidegger said the same thing about Aristotle. He said people say things about Aristotle. He was a defender of slavery, this, that. His view of women was sort of, profoundly mistaken from our contemporary ears. But he says
he took very good care of the housekeeper.
Wow.
In the will. I've read the will.
I didn't say he said.
Yes, I
right?
said it. Of course, I'm going to say it.
So Heidegger said, Aristotle, he said, this is what I want to say about Aristotle. Heidegger said this. He said, Aristotle was a man who was born in a particular historical moment. He lived his life and he died. Now let's go to his ideas. Okay, because that's the important thing about Aristotle. His ideas, the stuff that he left for us to ponder. We can say the same thing about Heidegger. I mean, we can, of course, and in many ways we should critique his politics. How can somebody so profoundly insightful about the human condition misjudge or see something in the nationalist socialist project that was enticing for him for a few months? I think. Other people say that he was, a committed Nazi forever. I don't think so. But he did say the Nazis heard me, but they didn't understand me, right? That was the sentence. The people in the room heard me, but they didn't.
One of his famous statements was that what parades as National Socialism does not speak to the inner greatness of its movement. So in some ways, he was a
really profound Nazi.
In other ways, he was saying Hitler was a very small guy
in a big
historical moment of the German.
See, but the Wollens, I got the paper, very interesting, the big paper from his presentation at NYU.
I read that. That's the one I invited you to.
Personally, without being a scholar of Heidegger, I think that's a very kind of a understandable but superficial reading of Heidegger. Just like he said about Aristotle. I mean, Heidegger had certain politics that are awful, but you can't really do much better than him. You can't do better than him, I think, in the 20th century. I just think it's very difficult. I mean, look at these sentences. The propositional logos says how a thing is and what the matter is. Logic deals, therefore, with this asserting. Such asserting, I mean, look at the construction of the writing. Each sentence begs for the follow-up sentence. I mean, this is writing of extraordinary precision and clarity. I mean, you see some of this in Ilyenkov's article. But here it's even more concentrated form. Logic deals, therefore, with this asserting. Such asserting is pronounced to and is repeated by others. Pronounced propositions are put down in statements. It goes on and on. This is just 2 paragraphs. Now, I'm just going to read for a few more sentences from this, but I recommend this book. And this is in the introductory lecture of Heidegger on logic from 1934, where there's a 3-page summary of Aristotle's categorical syllogism. Section 1, the inner structure of logic. So, we are attempting now in advance, Heidegger says, to display briefly the general frame of the inner structure of logic under the 4 methods that determine the structure of logic since the Greeks up to our time. Section 1, analysis. The proposition is at first taken as something present at hand, like a thing that exists. It encounters us. The proposition encounters us at first. Remember all the difficulties we had last time when we tried to explain when I tried to explain what a proposition is? That it's a sentence that's categorical, that says something that is either true or false, but the assumption is it says something that is true, right? So Heidegger says, he's trying to explain what a proposition is, as the proposition encounters us at first in a pronounced statement. For example, the sky is overcast. That's a proposition. The statement as word construction can be analyzed into the individual words, like we did last time. Sky, overcast, is, the copula, the subject, the predicate. Words to which particular representations correspond. Then he says, assembly takes place. The sky is overcast is nothing other than an interlacing, as the Greeks say. The proposition composed in this manner can now, in its turn, provide the piece from which a further structure of a logical kind is composed. He's explaining to us why Aristotle insisted on the 3-part structure of the syllogism. The proposition composed in this manner can now in turn provide the piece from which a further structure of a logical kind is composed. For out of several statements, right? 2 statements and a conclusion statement. For out of several statements, a further logical construction can be assembled. That is, out of 2 judgments, a third can be derived. The derivation of a third judgment out of the 2 given ones consists in the combination of the concepts that are still not connected in these. This combination is only possible then if it is mediated through a concept that is connected to both judgments. So he gives us a very I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's just 2 pages, but it's a very concise, compacted overview of the syllogism. And then he says, but this is not good enough anymore. We need to overturn it and redo it, right? And then you can sort of read the rest of the lecture that goes through Kant and Leibniz and so on and so forth. And he has some amazing things to say about mathematics and formal logic. You know, Heidegger has a degree in, he studied mathematics as a young man, so, and I think he got bored, you know, and he studied religion too, you know, and so it's not like he's speaking
What's the
out
title of that book?
Logic as the question concerning the essence of language. You know. Okay, so I want to see, look at the
He
time.
didn't mess around.
He didn't mess around.
That's the one thing he didn't do.
There's no semicolons or colons in any of the titles.
You can see Hannah Arendt in the classes, right?
You know, modern in academia we have all these like formulas like there's a colon or a semicolon. It's like a, you know, none of that stuff. Very simple. Being in time. That's it. You know, question concerning technology.
Then you inverted time and being.
And by the way, I just want to
37 years later.
point your attention to the Ilyenkov article, which is exactly in the same spirit, kind of the same sort of school of thinking. Ilyenkov does say that the most important goal when you're learning how to think is learning how to formulate the question correctly,
Right.
correctly related to whatever is it that you're trying to study. That's exactly what Heidegger teaches repeatedly, how to formulate a question correctly. Because if you don't, you're going to arrive at answers that are irrelevant or meaningless or less meaningful. Right? So you have this obsession, like if you're going to study
This
logic,
is his real value to me.
Yeah.
That he frames the questions, you know. It really is the question concerning technology being a masterpiece and how we think about technology versus technique, these kind of things. What you just read, how we usually understand logic but should understand it differently in relationship to language, you know. All of these things are, yeah.
And how long was the introduction to Being in Time where he presents the question? 59 pages?
Yeah, something like that.
59 pages to
Yeah.
arrive and present the question.
Right. So I mean, this is something that we may have forgotten. We have too many yeses and nos, and the whole positivist tradition has disallowed this kind of path of questioning, etc.
Absolutely.
So we can get this back from him, right? In many ways.
And we should probably read Heidegger as a different course in method, like along with other people, different from the dialectical logic that we're emphasizing here. I'm just going to write this here just as a reference, so we can refer to it from last time. And I'm going to really try in a disciplined way to start the Ilyenkov at 7:30. Whatever happens, we can go back to the Aristotle.
That's for Josh. We're going to have to let Josh watch it on.
I'll watch it on
watch
YouTube.
it on the. Okay.
No problem.
So here we have the two propositions and the necessary conclusion that emerges from this. Right now, we talked about a basic presentation of the syllogism. We talked about the structure of a categorical proposition. We talked about the is, the subject, the predicate, the copula, and so on, and so the quantifier. And now we have to add the major, minor premises and the terms. So we can say Roman numeral 1, or as one of my students said a couple of years ago, why do you keep writing the uppercase I every time you start your notes?
No, but seriously.
So, a term. So a term, what is a term? A term refers to, for example, examples of the term are, for example, the subject, the predicate, right? These are referred to as terms, but what is a term? A term can be thought of as a boundary, a word or collection of words, and here you can make the bridge with the categories of Aristotle, where he discusses in book 6, where he discusses, continuous, discrete structures. He talks about words, he talks about time, lines, right? So a term is a boundary, which is to say it is a word, or or a collection of words which recalls or transmits the idea of something or a thing in itself or through some of its attributes. Okay, so a term then, I like this idea of a boundary. A term is a boundary. You can say a boundary of meaning, or of concentrated meaning, right? A boundary, I'm going to say maybe in parentheses, of meaning. It manifests itself through words, because that's how we communicate as human beings. A word, or a collection of words. Which recalls or simply transmits, conveys the idea of something, whatever it is that we're talking about. So these are sort of like the atomistic, if you will, fundamental component parts of the syllogism, but also how we communicate. From Lukánin, this Soviet Aristotelian, he has a nice formulation of the term, or the terminus, right, in the Latin. He calls it a point of division, of separation, a border. Okay? That becomes important with Hegel, of course, or with any kind of dialectical thought, when you talk about borders and transcendence of borders, well-formed ideas that in order for movement to happen in thinking, we have to have some kind of a cross-border or overcoming of borders or trans-border movement where you leave behind some kind of an insight that you hold as obvious, and then that insight becomes then rejected by you, by your mind, as you negate it, for example. Like the concept of the negation, and then ultimately the negation of the negation, plays with this idea of borders, boundaries that need to be transcended beyond the well-formed. So thinking is a process of formation, right? A process of informing, if you will. So Aristotle kind of anticipates this importance of terms as boundaries, as borders of well-defined meanings that play that help us think in various ways.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Like the terms, can it also be like interpreted as terms of an agreement, so to speak? Like in that sense, the boundaries of that particular, one would agree to believing, let's say Socrates has wings or something, like that is
you're saying, so for example, Socrates is a term. Socrates, there is a certain, if you will, border around this word which delimits the meaning of that word in that sense. Like Socrates, when we read or hear Socrates, we immediately understand a particular or a series of particular meanings that are well defined. Oh, you may be talking about the ancient Greek thinker. Oh, you may be referring to some app that exists on the iPhone. Oh, you may be, in that sense, that they're true, it refers to true values. Are you thinking in that sense?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's in
it's
other words.
Also, I guess, is like a sort of suspension of predetermined like ideas. So
Yeah.
let's say that the sentence says Socrates can fly. Like we know it's not true, but like let's say we didn't know it wasn't true. Then the terms are set in that formula, so to speak. And
Well, I mean, you bring up something
terms.
interesting here, because Aristophanes actually plays on that in the clouds. Socrates thinks he's in the clouds and can fly.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this kind of absurdist logic in Greek comedy, which speaks to your point, in terms of kind of other kind of syllogistic reasoning.
Yeah, I mean,
I think, one way of thinking about terms, at least I think could be helpful in this context, is to think of the roles that they play in a category, right? The role that's being played out in categorization or in predication, in this whole thing of, Aristotelian syllogistic reasoning.
In other words, they do
What
contain
role
meaning.
in relation.
And
Where were they going?
the well-encapsulated meaning that the term Socrates already conveys to people is going to enable the syllogism to basically complete its logical movement.
Right.
Right? So the terms, by being well-defined, if you will, bordered, encapsulated meanings that are discrete from each other, because Socrates means something specific or particular, man means something, it's universal. This is not a universal, this is a particular. This also has a certain meaning in terms of a historical figure. This has a meaning in terms of it refers to our sort of the universal descriptor of the human, right? So the fact that these things have well-defined meanings enable the movement of thinking to complete its course, to be true or necessary or not or whatever.
But you have three universals and one particular, and that particular syllogism.
The particular is, of course, Socrates. And
Yeah,
as you
your only particular is Socrates.
Yeah, and that's the most important one. That's the only thing we care about. That's why in the first figure, the perfect figure of the syllogism, you have a movement, like in all syllogisms in Aristotle's logic, this kind of logic, you have a movement from the universal to the particular.
Well, the point I'm driving at is that maybe you can always only focus on one particular. Maybe you have to always have three universals.
Yes, but the focus is always the particular ultimately,
No, I
because we
understand
know
that.
from the categories, the particular is the most important thing.
Right.
Because that grounds us into daily life through particulars, right? I refer to you as Alita, I don't refer to you as a human being. Usually. I mean, you're also a human being, of course, that's encapsulated in your thing, but it's much more meaningful to me to address you as Alita, because that's much more concrete and vibrant in my mind. When I say Alita, I think about something specific. When I say Alita, the human being, I'm not really sure what I'm talking about. It's less immediately useful to humans. That's just the way we're built, Aristotle is suggesting, right? So the terminus then is a point of division. I just want to add this because I think this is a kind of a point of division, separation, a border. This is borrowed from Lukanen, who you're going to have to take my word for it because it's not translated in English.
We'll take
But
it.
hopefully one day it will be.
Yeah.
Again, last thing about the term. The term is a singular concept, which is connected to another singular concept, the predicate, for example. In this case, through the connectives is or is not, and not through its speech formulation, which can be complex or combine multiple words. Now, this is important. So, for example, Socrates is a living creature is composed of 5 words, right? So let's just do this example, just to illustrate this point about terms. You have this sentence. Socrates is a living creature. Which is a true statement. And this is composed of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words, right? This sentence, if you will. But there are only 2 terms. Right? What are the terms? The terms are Socrates, living creature. 3 terms. Sorry, 2 terms, not 3. Because if we count the words, there are 5 words. But if we look at the meaning that the sentence is conveying, we just have the subject-predicate relation. That's the most important thing that's happening here. We have the predicate and the subject. Even though the predicate contains 2 words, and the subject contains 1 word, that's not important. The importance of the term, thinking in terms of terms when we hear this sentence, again points our attention to the subject-predicate relations and what is being predicated and so on and so forth. Okay, so here again, just to repeat, the syllogism is built from 3 terms. The syllogism is built from 3 terms, and between the 2 terms introduced in the premises, a 3rd term is inserted, which becomes the middle term, which makes the syllogism possible. Okay, so just schematically, in this case, the mediating term is this. we have a subject. At the end, we have a predicate. So we have 1, 2, 3. Right? We have 3 terms that create a syllogism. One of those 3 terms is a special term, which is the most important term, and that's the mediating term or the middle term. Okay, which is sort of like the connective tissue that makes the logical argument true and obvious and necessary. Okay. Last sort of point about the terms, just 3 different ways of thinking about the terms. So A, B, and C. The most concise kind of way of thinking about the terms is that terms are simply the subjects and predicates of the propositions. Okay. And here we have to add one last detail about the terms. Because terms are subjects and predicates, and we know this from the categories, a term can either be a particular or a universal. For example, on your letter D, a term, I want to put this here, a term can be a particular or a universal. We have some examples. So for example, a term can be Socrates, or Arto, in which case, obviously, these are particulars. Or it could be, human, white, color, dolphin, in which case, these are examples of terms that are universal. And this is just another way of saying that terms, CDE, terms represent categories. Okay, just to show that Aristotle is building on the categories and everything that he talked about in terms of subject, predicates, universal, particular, the graphs that we did, the little square that we did, set up in terms essentially represent categories, and EF. And an interesting point here that we should be aware of is that subjects can be either particular or universal. While predicates can only be universal. And I'll give you an example. We're not saying anything profound here. These are just observations made from Aristotle kind of synthesizing these things, but also his commentators clarifying it for us. Example. Humans are not snakes. Okay? Arto is a human being. So Arto, in this case, the subject is a particular. Human beings, and the predicate is universal. However, we can't say Arto is a Socrates. That makes no sense. Right? You can't have a particular being predicated by a particular. Being predicated by another particular. Right? So Aristotle would say that doesn't make any sense. That's not how we communicate. That's not how we transfer meaning. Now here, just in the interest of time, I also want to add the discussion of major and minor terms. Can I erase this sign?
Yep.
Okay. This was supposed to be a whiteboard originally, right? Or not really?
No,
Oh, interesting.
I think it's
So
great.
more soothing to the eye.
yeah.
You know, the beige. Uh-oh, are we not erasing?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Should we do a minor? Let's do. Okay, let's just present the major and minor, and then we'll. I just want to sort of have this stuff on our notes, so to speak, for the Hegel actually, and then we can go back with the Aristotle and add a little bit, sort of a more detailed discussion, because Hegel, maybe we'll upload this as well. Hegel has a nice summary of Aristotle's syllogism in his encyclopedia. You know, Hegel wrote, among other things, a gigantic encyclopedia encapsulating all known philosophical thought of his day, and he commented on everyone, including Chinese thinkers and so on and so forth. And he has a section in Aristotle's syllogism, which we should read before we dive into the Hegel syllogism as well. And I think then we'll pause and have additional kind of discussion on the figures. But just to add a few more pieces, so major, minor. Now this is going to be a little bit kind of terse, and I apologize, but I just want to present it, and then we will hopefully make it more meaningful as we connect it with the Hegel. Major, minor premise. So here we can say that the subject, and from now on, just in the interest of brevity, every time we talk about the subject, we'll just use the word S, the letter S, right? So the subject of a conclusion, for example, Socrates is mortal, will be the minor term. Okay, so this would be, Aristotle would call them the minor term. We'll go later on into the meanings of what. And then the predicate of the conclusion and from now on we'll use the letter P, right, for the predicate, will be the major term. Aristotle has a very interesting discussion about the moods of the syllogisms. And why are certain things where they are in terms of the predication and so on and so forth, depending on the mood and the position. You know, some syllogisms are more perfect than others, even though they're both true. You know, which I think to a modern logician, this is where this stuff is really obsolete, because you're talking about moods and strange kind of ontological categories that don't mean much sense from this more mathematicized formal logic point of view. But we know that Aristotle's not interested in that kind of formalism. You know? Okay, so if we wanted to add this, this is P, right? This predicate is the major, because this is the predicate of the conclusion. This is the conclusion. S, this is the subject of the conclusion. And then, of course, this we would call M, which is the middle term. Okay? Like that. Now, D, the middle term, will appear in both major and minor premises, but not in the conclusion. Right? So this is like a schematic presentation, but we'll focus on the meaning later. So this is the major premise. This is the minor premise. This is the conclusion. So, right, so Aristotle is saying the middle term will appear in both premises, in the major and minor premise, but not in the conclusion. But its appearance in the two premises makes the conclusion possible. Right? So this is the interesting part about kind of well-formed thinking that forms meaning in ways that are logically sound from Aristotle's point of view. So, A, B, C, D, the middle term will appear in both major and minor premises, but not in the conclusion.
Do you want to call that the middle term, or do you want to call that the mediating term?
We can do both. The mediating term is clearer because it's the mediation, right? It mediates. It's present in both, right? First as a predicate, then as a sub. So yeah, we can call it the middle term or the mediating term.
Yeah.
The mediating term. Now here's interesting. Another interesting observation. The mediating term can be the predicate of one premise and the subject of another. It can be the premise of both. It could be the predicate of both premises or the subject of both premises. And those are all the only possibilities that you can have. And these are the three figures of the syllogism, defined by what the mediating term is. Is it a? In this case, it's the subject of the first premise, of the major premise. And then it becomes the predicate of the minor premise. Right? This is the first figure of the syllogism in Aristotle's language. You'll see two other examples, second and third figure, where in the second figure, there'll be different kind of sentences with different kind of meanings arranged in such a way that the mediating term will only be the predicate in both premises. And then in the third figure, the mediating term will be only the subject in both premises, right? And these are the three possible permutations. There is a debate in the tradition whether there are four figures in the syllogism, but Aristotle rejected that notion. So we'll go with, we're not going to get into that because we don't want to be scholars of Aristotle. We want to get to the street. Anyway, so I could write this on the board, but it might be better. Well, let's just write it just to be consistent in saying, letter D, that the mediating term will not always have the same placement, but rather depend on the various figures. Okay? So the figures here refers to the placement of the mediating term. Is it a predicate in which premise? Is it a subject in which premise? Okay? All right. Why is that important? Well, for Aristotle it's important because it has to do with the quality of the truthfulness of the syllogism, if you will, from more perfect to less perfect. Okay, let's just do one more thing before we go to. Can I erase this part? I can. Right, this is the older. Before we go to the Ilyenkov reading and get started. So we can rewrite this syllogism, right, using let's see. Okay, so if we want to get into sort of the logical figures and get away from the language, right, from the actual sentences that are spelled out, we can represent these three sentences as this. Right? M stands for the mediating term. This is the predicate of the conclusion. This is the subject of the conclusion. Right? So this means all men are mortal. This means Socrates is a man, and this means Socrates is mortal. Therefore. But Aristotle doesn't use SMP. That's a Latin thing from the scholastic Middle Ages. He uses, we can use A, B, and C, for example. That's another alternative. But if you do that, the order of the reading is different. So here we read left to right, right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. We read left to right. However, you can also represent this, I can write on top of it, A, B. B, C. I'll just do it like this. So here you're reading left to right, and here you're going to read right to left. And you'll see, it's just a different way of thinking about it. And this would be A, C. And actually, this is how Aristotle thinks of the syllogism, right? So in other words, if we want to read this the way he's framing it in his writing, he would say something like, a mortality, right? A mortality is inherent in all men. Mortality is inherent in all men, right? Then he would say, man is inherently present in Socrates, right? Because Socrates is a man. Therefore, right? Mortality is inherently present in Socrates himself. So this is sort of like the other way of reading the syllogism left to right, by looking at the predication first. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And he's using the Greek alphabet, alpha,
And he's using
beta,
the Greek
gamma,
alphabet, yeah.
as his three locations here.
So I think, let me just give the two other figures, and then we can break with the Aristotle. And then we'll come back to it when we do the Hegel syllogism as well. So, the three figures. Right, so we have the first figure. This is the perfect figure.
Again, a Latin term, because in the Greek it's schema.
Schema.
Schema is figure. Yeah, what we call schemes, comes from the Greek schema, yeah,
Like
which
schema,
really means
like this?
figures of, yes. Yeah, schema.
That's better.
Yeah,
Schema.
yeah, schema.
I like it.
Yeah.
The Latin is just impoverished.
Well, that's
It's
what
an
Heidegger
impoverished
thought.
version of it.
It's imperialism
It's
at
a
work.
boring language.
It's imperialism at work.
Yeah.
With all due credit to
Imperialism strips
the
away
Nazi
the,
art was imperial. He should have seen that too. It
So-
was much more Roman gnosis than Greek gnosis anyway. Yeah.
I'm just going to do it like this. In the first figure, the mediating term is the subject of one premise
Right.
and the predicate of another. And the example is what we have here. Here you have the mediating term, which is men, or man. In this case, it's the subject of one premise and the predicate of another. Okay? Now the second figure, these are the different permutations that Aristotle deduced of all possible ways of forming a syllogism, categorical syllogism. In the second figure, M, the mediating term, is the predicate of both premises. And we can do an example just to illustrate. And the example would be something like every Roman stadium. Actually, I don't know if this is true, but I think so. Every Roman stadium is made of stone. First premise. Second premise. No skyscraper is made of stone.
I'm sorry, I can't, every
Every Roman stadium is made of stone.
What's the R?
Roman. Roman stadium is made of stone.
Oh, okay.
No skyscraper is made of stone. Therefore, no skyscraper is a Roman stadium. In this case, the mediating term is stone, and in both cases, in both premises, it functions as the predicate.
Okay, quick question.
Yeah.
Could it be changed or shifted to say something to the conclusion such as no skyscraper is Roman built, or no skyscraper is Roman, or does it have to be Roman stadium? In other words,
Yes.
is that okay?
Why? Because remember, the conclusion of the syllogism that you are asserting has to make use only of whatever is presented in the two premises.
Two premises.
It cannot bring something from outside or leave something out that was already mentioned here. Does that make
So
sense?
we're working
Or
with it.
leave something out.
Or leave
Okay,
something out.
because-
Yeah, it's working with
Yeah.
the sentence.
Yeah. In other words, if you've asserted this, and this is true because all Roman stadiums are made out of stone of some kind, no skyscraper is made out of stone. That's also true.
Right, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, the conclusions that I just, brought up, they're not like strong deviations from that premise. So that's why it's, but you,
Yeah.
but it,
I mean,
I can
it's,
see that would get very complicated, like that, you can't jump to conclusions or something. You can't make.
Right.
No,
right,
the
okay.
words have to be in the.
yeah, it has to be obviously derived from the premises. And if it cannot be seen as having been derived from the premises, then it's not a syllogism. It might be some other kind of a assertion that's
Logic,
true, but
yeah.
it's not a syllogism. Yeah. And then the third figure, just to conclude, you can already guess the permutation for the third figure. In the third figure, it's going to be the subject, right? In the third figure, the mediating term is the subject of both premises. And an example would be, for example, every bird has feathers. I don't know if this is, every bird has feathers. Every bird is warm-blooded, creature. Therefore, some warm-blooded creatures have feathers. And that's a true conclusion. Some, right? Because there are other warm-blooded creatures that may not have feathers, but in this case, so in here, the mediating term is bird, right? It appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion, but it makes its appearance here in this way makes the conclusion possible. The placement of the mediating term in both set premises is subject, right? So Aristotle says these are the three figures of syllogistic kind of forms that are possible, and there are interesting differences between them. One being, the first figure being the most perfect, the most obviously true in its functioning as a syllogism. But we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
Could you also have said every feathered creature or some feathered creatures are warm-blooded?
Yeah, but then it would be it would be deviating from the first two premises. So it would be some kind of other true conclusion, but it won't be a syllogism. In other words,
Think about that.
if you present these two premises, because this is
Yeah,
what
but
you
you're
want
not
to talk
saying-
about.
But you've never said that every feathered creature is a bird. You've only said every feathered every bird has feathers.
Every bird has feathers, right?
So that's
true.
not an identity.
Well, every bird has feathers, right? So that would be. I don't know if I don't know if that's a true statement. Like maybe there is some bird that doesn't have feathers, but I thought like that's a true statement. I mean that could be a little limitation of.
I think that's.
But you get the point, right? In other words, if you say something that's true where
Yeah,
the mediating term is the subject,
Yeah.
and then if you find another sentence, you construct another sentence where in this field of meaning, where the mediating term continues to function as the subject, right? Then the conclusion that you will have will follow from that as well. But the important thing for us and for Aristotle here is to observe the functioning of the mediating terms.
I understand that.
The actual details of the examples, yes, I mean they could be improved, but the point is, actually I knew that if I used birds, probably there is some bird that doesn't have feathers.
Are there any other conclusions that can come from those two predicates? Or is that the only one?
That's the only one, or that should be the only one, based on the two premises. You can come up with other conclusions, but that means you're using information from outside of those two
But
premises.
what if it was every bird has feathers and is warm-blooded?
Then you're saying the same thing.
Then
You're just presenting it as one sentence
Yeah.
instead of
To
two.
use it in conjunction,
Right.
one proposition.
Yeah. I mean, he pretty much distilled these into. Yeah.
Okay.
No,
I like conjunctions.
No, but it's good.
Yeah,
Like, we're
it's cool.
thinking. We're
Yeah,
thinking.
both end.
We're thinking. I mean, this
Right,
is not easy for sure. Now let's leave Aristotle behind a little bit and let's shift to the Ilyenkov essay. I hope people have the essay. Do you have the essay handy?
I don't.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I'll read sections of it because I want to read it, and I go through certain sections because they're useful.
You know the year this was written? I see the year it's published, but do you know?
I'm guessing it's in the
constructed-
60s,
constructed
late
this
60s.
late
Oh, sure.
60s? Yeah.
Yeah,
It's 2007 in terms of
yeah. The English
publication
translation
and
is
translation,
yeah. It started now.
Yeah.
But they started appearing now. But
Okay, the word is that all birds do have feathers.
oh, okay, all right.
All right.
All right.
There you go. So we got a
Is it
syllogism.
Google? Did Google confirm?
Kids
That's
science, kids science. Kids science
All right.
and inference.
Okay, now let's shift to Ilyenkov. Very interesting. I'm going to pass around this reference. Recently, a book has been actually this year. A book was published by Bloomsbury in London called "The Phoenix of Philosophy: Russian Thought of the Late Soviet Period." I don't like the title Russian thought because, again, when people talk about Soviet period, it's a multinational, multi-ethnic society. It's not Russian thought, and the figures that they talk about are not all ethnic Russians. So, but I know why they say it, because the language is sort of like the Russian language was the unifying medium, kind of like English is for the United States, or internationally today or whatnot. But finally, we have a book that presents 11 thinkers who were previously not available or mostly not available in English of Soviet philosophy, which kind of exposes this interesting aspect of Western philosophy that was not present because of Cold War politics and intra-Soviet politics, because a lot of these thinkers, they were not prosecuted, they were not sort of jailed for what they wrote by any means. They had prestigious positions and so on and so forth. But, not everything they wrote was published for reasons of dogma and so on and so forth. So if you're interested, it's the best kind of and the only available overview, and Ilyenkov's in there. Okay, so let's look at this essay. Our schools must teach how to think, and as I told Alita, this was an essay that was written for a popular audience. Can you imagine? It's a 40-page essay on dialectics that was written in the equivalent of Harper's or something. Okay, so I think I'm sharing this essay because I think it's a good introduction into Hegel, and it's a very useful kind kind of distillation of Hegel and some aspects of Hegel's thinking about dialectical logic, but it's also a very powerful intervention on its own, on the question of education, learning, what kind of subjectivity do we want to form in a modern world. And along the way, we have interesting definitions of key concepts, as you'll see. So, and I think as more of Ilyenkov's work and some of the other people, like they have a great phenomenologist, Mamardashvili, who was Georgian, who wrote in Russian, major phenomenologist. You have Ilyenkov, major Marxist thinker. By the time the translators are finished, I think you'll see how 20th century philosophy will be read different once these people... Mamardashvili has lectures on Proust. There are 3,000 pages. Okay? It took 2 years. They're published in Russian now. It's like 2 volumes this big on Proust. And this Georgian Soviet thinker, he also has fundamental essays on Marx, on consciousness, but he was not a Marxist. He thought through Marx and with Marx, and he was critical, but he was more of a kind of a phenomenologist, was aware of Heidegger, Husserl. He was friends with Althusser. He was close friends with Althusser. They exchanged a number of letters that have now been published in Russian. Some letters are published in English between Mamardashvili and Althusser. A Georgian Soviet thinker, very, very great thinker.
I think I have a translation of his.
Georgian.
Yeah, Georgian. And he didn't write much in the sense that I think he really wrote 2 books. He was more like Socrates, they said. He just lectured and kind of talked. And a lot of his books now are actually kind of like with Heidegger. They're just distillation of his lecture. Students wrote it or recorded on cassettes or whatever. Okay, so let's sort of read sections of this because they're very interesting passages. Now, our schools must teach how to think! Exclamation point. So what is Ilyenkov doing here? Well, there are many things that he's doing, but the fundamental question is, what does it mean to think? What does it mean to think? And what is thinking? Right? These are fundamental questions, always. Heidegger, what is Heidegger's? What is called thinking?
What is called thinking.
What is called thinking.
How do we use the appellative representation, thinking?
Another great lecture from the 50s.
We have not yet begun to think.
We have not yet begun to think. Yes. From the 50s, right? The Heidegger?
Yeah, it was post-World War.
Old Heidegger. It's sort of mature Heidegger, towards the end. Not towards the end.
Post-apologetic. Yeah, no, he didn't die until...
Post-Nazi period.
Until 76, he died.
Yeah. By the way, his Heidegger's notebooks have been published, or 3 volumes. I kind of briefly read through some pages. It's extremely interesting. He was much more political than I thought. He was really thinking in terms of politics as war, essentially. There were all kinds of metaphors as war, and
It was the pole and the polos.
The polemic,
the war, and the polos
and
is always being thought through in terms of his work. You have to remember there's a massive militarization going on, in 33 and 34, and he's trying to think this through in terms of, Plato's Republic, the warlike state. This becomes very interesting for, at least scholarly purposes and to learn.
The more I think about Heidegger,
revolution.
The more I learn about Heidegger, the more I think that he was like in a certain sense a Nietzschean conservative revolutionary thinker, anti-liberal. That was the primary target. Not so much anti-Soviet, because he says some sort of things about the Soviets at the time. They were like, well, they're certainly not doing what the liberals are doing. So there's a complicated relationship there. He sees the Soviets as an adversary, I guess as the Nazis did, as their prime adversary politically. But the liberals are the main target. He hated liberal society, capitalist liberalism. He called it breeds the mediocrity of the average. It's one of the most powerful sentences I've heard. Right. The mediocrity of the average. The
dictatorship of the they-self.
Yeah.
The dictatorship of the they-self.
The dictatorship of the
everybody
they-self.
will be told how to vote through the opinion polls, and everybody.
And by the way,
learn from the TV opinion
Yeah.
and shaping of propaganda.
And this, I think, gels with Kant's letter, essay on what is enlightenment, when he talks about domestication of people, where others think for you. And you're going to see Ilyenkov literally quotes Kant or references Kant in this way as well, in his own critique of Soviet society. Because this is a critique of Soviet society, sort of the dogmas that the Soviets were doing as they became liberal themselves in the 1990s. All right, so page 9. So what is thinking? What does it mean to think? So Ilyenkov says here, very often, much more often perhaps than it seems, we mix up two very different things here, especially in practice. So what are things that we mix up? We mix the development of the ability to think and the process of formal mastering of knowledge specified in curricula. So in other words, there's a basic distinction between the acquisition of formal knowledge that you acquire that others give you, and that is called thinking, but that's not thinking. Thinking is something completely different from the acquisition in a formal way, like in school, memorize this, do that, do this, repeat this. That's not what thinking is, but that's what thinking is called in society, in his society, but also in our society.
Yeah, I had a friend who, he went to school in Moscow, and they had to memorize Capital, Volume 1, 2, and 3,
Yeah.
and recite it.
Wow.
Like the Quran.
Yeah, I mean, what's the value? What's the value of that, right?
Yeah.
Versus understanding, memorizing sections of Capital in the course of thinking through it, right? Yeah, that kind of. So that's what drove Ilyenkov crazy, basically. And I should say this is an anecdote. Ilyenkov, at the end of his life, he died at 57. He killed himself. He slit his own throat in his own apartment.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
The last lecture he attended was in the College of, so to speak, Psychology, which was ground zero of the most interesting Soviet thinkers, like the famous psychologists, Elkonin, Davidov, Luria, and so on and so forth. And he delivered a lecture essentially to 400 psychology PhDs and undergrads, like the most elite, Moscow State University, kind of like Harvard, and he was laughed at. Like he would say certain things about dialectics or this and that, and people would giggle in the audience. They'd be like, "This guy's crazy. He's like an old school, like Hegelian. Like who cares about that stuff?" And Ilyenkov comes home and he says, "These people are liberals. They're liberals. They're liberal positivists." And he says, "We're finished. We're finished." If that if that audience found this topic laughable, he said, "We're finished." And then he killed himself.
Should be inspired.
But he did say you have to live, you have an obligation to stay alive while the possibility for the struggle remains. So he stayed alive while the possibility of the struggle in the world of ideas in his world remained. But once he decided that there is no possibility for struggle because the situation is gone and there is no thinking left anymore, then he basically, did what he did. So anyways, so we have a mixture of, we have to be careful not to, so in other words, if the question is, what is thinking? We cannot conflate, right, the formal acquisition of received knowledge, right? So in other words, if I'm on the receiving end of knowledge through schooling, and I'm put in a situation where I basically have to memorize, memorization is important. Obviously we do that every human being has the capacity to memorize. Our immune system has 3 levels of memory apparently, in the cellular level. We memorize stuff. But if thinking has been replaced by the formal acquisition of somebody else's knowledge, right, already well-formed knowledge, then you're essentially, you're just obeying blindly. It's a form of obedience and not the actual deployment of the most human thing we have, which is the ability to make sense of things that materially confront us. Okay? Through the process of contradictions and their resolution. Right? So this is literally Kant as well, in the letter of What is Enlightenment. Domestication is the inability to think on your own and the conditioned living where you always seek others for answers to everything that concerns you.
Which leads to the cult of liberal democracies, cult of the expert.
The cult of the expert, because they know.
This right now in the impeachment hearings, we begin to see, this clown show that's going on of all the experts in constitutional law, rules of engagement, all this kind of stuff, in a way.
It is a form of domestication.
Yes, thoroughly.
And Kant hated this. This was not what the Enlightenment was supposed to be about.
Right.
The Enlightenment was supposed to be about attempting to figure out a way how to think. And Ilyenkov is saying everybody has the ability to develop the thinking. Right. Everybody. It's a universal human capacity that's dormant, that's in us. It's not guaranteed to ever be developed, but everybody can do it in their own way, right? And what he's seeing in his world, in the Soviet Union, but also you can argue in the West as well, is domestication, is the formation of, Foucault would say disciplinary society, right? You're conditioned to act in a certain way, right? So Foucault's language is disciplinary society, and Kant's language is domestication, like domestic animals, like your dog. Kant makes this reference, like you can think about it like the difference between a dog domesticated by humans and a wolf, right? You can make this parallel. A wolf is a thinking creature, if you will, because it has to. It has to engage with the world that it lives in to find a way to live, to eat, to deal with danger, to create a home where it's going to sleep. The domesticated wolf, the dog, has given up that ability, right, that it has. And as a result, it's dumber. It's literally like the brain, I'm told, if people will study, like the brain of a dog that weighs the same amount as a wolf is smaller by 20 or 25%, evolutionarily speaking, over time, because it doesn't need to exercise those thinking powers, if you will, because the human will feed it.
Yeah, you can see it if you ever looked into the face of a wolf.
Of a wolf?
Yeah.
They're amazing.
What do you think?
They're not.
They're not.
Yeah, there's none of that. They're like.
How will this taste?
Yeah. Okay. It's. I hate to use the word problem solving because it's such a positivistic thing, but they're compelled to find.
They're evaluating.
To overcome. So the development of the ability to think and the process of formal mastering of knowledge specified in curricula, these are not equivalent things. Thinking does not mean that. By no means do these two processes, he says, automatically coincide, although one without the other is impossible. So in other words, the formal acquisition of received knowledge is connected to the process of thinking, but they're not synonymous. They're two different things. And he says that's something so obvious that's forgotten so easily. In the school curricula, for example.
And what he seems to be really setting up here in a very clever way is the difference between formal logic and formalization of knowledge versus dialectical logic.
That's exactly true.
And
You're
this
right.
is really what he's setting up in this essay in a very beautiful way. I think it's a very clever, introduction to the problem of formal logic, formalization of knowledge, as you put up there, formal acquisition of received knowledge.
So formalization.
Domesticity versus the killing, and going back to the animal world, the animal that thinks too, right? The animality, the bestiality is also being, tamed in a certain way. That's part of the disciplinary society.
The taming of us as living beings, complicated beings that can think, that can overcome contradictions, that can find a way to build a bridge between something that is A and something that is not A, right? Which is at the core of the Hegelian Marxist project, or Aristotle's project, right, as well. So it is a beautiful quote by Heraclitus, who said, he says 2,000 years ago, Heraclitus said, "Much knowledge does not train the mind, although lovers of wisdom must know much." One of the beautiful
That's why he was known as the obscure. That was his nickname.
So much knowledge does not train the mind, although lovers of wisdom must know much.
He's the master.
That's a dialectical
paradox.
sentence
Yeah.
right there.
Well,
I mean, at the core.
Yeah.
You know, the seemingly contradictory things you're saying that are interconnected and complement each other. Each other.
Would you think of the two, because this is very, Lacan was very influenced in a way by this formalization. So his universal discourse is quite similar as the formal acquisition of received knowledge. But he also pretty much speculates that that there's an antagonism. It's not simply a matter of a not equals.
Yeah.
That there's an antagonism from...
In other words, I'm saying this is not synonymous with this, and you're absolutely right. There's a tension.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a tension.
That works both ways.
Yeah, there's a
And
tension between
can
thinking
be quite
and
volatile.
yeah.
Yeah, and you could also think of the shift too to the complete antithetical to the left there on the thinking and the dialectical thought. It becomes so outside
Right.
this relationship to the formalization.
That's right.
You need
And
both.
the domesticity.
Exactly.
and then it
Absolutely, you need both.
Yeah.
Both capacities have to be developed in the human being as an individual and as a social, the social body of
What's
the
the word that he wrote on that? double
Tension.
head?
tension.
Pardon?
Tension.
Tension.
Yeah. So there's a tension. In other words, both are necessary in the fully developed human being. Look, for Ilyenkov, communism is the politics that aims to achieve a society of maximally developed human beings. This is what communism meant for Lenin, for all the communists worth their name who were non-dogmatic thinkers. In Ilyenkov, as a communist, said communism simply means a society where human beings individually and as a whole are as fully developed as possible according to their own innate abilities. Fully developed means, among other things, having both capacities developed, both thinking, which we'll define later, and also having formally acquired received knowledge. You need both. Right? You need both, and if you can do both, if you can engage both of these parts of you in daily life, you are a fully developed human being.
Which may be part of the discussion, or beginning of the discussion, the difference between socialism and communism. The communism was always interested in the development of the whole human being. The whole human being, whereas socialism was always just thought of as a transitional moment in terms of socialization of production, et cetera.
Yeah, it's less interesting.
Redistributive wealth. It's not as imaginative, and in a way, it's almost kind of banal.
In my ears,
yeah.
I'm using Ilyenkov's definition of communism.
Right.
I think that's
Exactly.
the most radical.
Right.
This kind of a belief that the goal of your politics is not to, destroy capitalist private property just because that's it. No, the goal of communism is to arrive at the conditions where society is structured in a way where there's maximally fully developed human beings constitute that society. This is Kant's vision too. This is the European Enlightenment.
Yeah, and of course even
the most radical members of the European. I mean, Thomas Jefferson wouldn't disagree with that.
No, of course not.
Jefferson would support this idea.
It's a latent communist.
Latent communist, absolutely, in this terminology.
Jeffersonian
latent communism
as latent communism.
Yeah, he was not a Madison, right? Jefferson was not like Madison.
Right.
Yeah.
I like Jefferson a lot. I mean, I think he's the best part of what America could have been if that political faction won the fight. But that faction didn't win the fight, unfortunately. I mean, it's still alive, it's still here. It's part of American politics, But
New biography, joint biography, just published of Lafayette and Jefferson.
Who did this?
who did
the guy
this?
from New Orleans,
Just
Walter
came on.
Jacobson.
Interesting.
Who did this?
Do you know the author by chance?
Isaacson?
I
The guy from New
think I
Orleans
threw
who
it
was the
away.
Aspen Institute, right?
Pardon?
The guy from New Orleans who was with the Aspen Institute.
Yeah, well, it
Walter
was in,
Isaacson.
It was in Saturday's Wall Street Journal.
Check it out.
In that section that has book
Right, I think it's
reviews.
Walter Isaacson.
And would you maybe could we put Lincoln, the great Lincoln, as a person who, in a way, attempted to encapsulate both of these terms as a political thinker? I mean, the political genius who could do dialectical
probably.
Probably be better would be Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, would be a great example of
But I think this is an important.
I think so.
This is an important tension, right? Of
Yes, absolutely.
21st century politics.
Very true.
Do you want to live in a society where there's an attempt to establish the the tension that organically exists in human beings and cultivate human subjectivity that contains the developed ability to think along with the developed formal acquisition of received knowledge.
And the beautiful
This is a
thing
beautiful
here
way
is,
to define a political
and going back to his
objective.
curriculum.
And school
The attack
curriculum.
about curricula and social reproduction
Yeah,
of
you want
the
to design a
dominant
school
order.
curriculum. Right.
Exactly.
This
It's
should
against
be one starting point.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you?
No, no, no.
Oh,
Yeah.
But this is just the first sentence. I mean, we're only going to read.
Dialectics is a hard
I'm
struggle.
only going to
It
focus
goes-
on the first 29 pages. The other 29 pages are,
Okay,
they're very interesting, but they're moving away.
we kind of have to be out tonight
Yeah.
around 8th of it since it's the holiday season.
I think we'll make it to
I
page
kinda
3.
have that. We'll make
I think-
8:35 maybe.
For sure.
We'll give
8:30 we'll
5
be out of
minutes,
here.
okay.
So, truly, much knowledge in itself does not train the mind or the ability to think. What then does train the mind? See, again, I think methodologically speaking, this is a very good writer. It's like Heidegger. There's always these questions that emerge in the text. So, we want to know about thinking. What is thinking? But how can we train the mind to think becomes the next question. That's the transformation of our original question. Right? So this is a good way of actually writing as well, I think. So in other words, what is thinking? And then this question becomes transformed. How do we learn to think? Right? And this sort of, there are these transformations of the guided question that are always guiding the writing and the thinking. Okay, so he says, look, there's a dumb answer to that question. How do we learn how to think? At the bottom of page 9, the first page, he
Can I
says,
have this?
Oh yeah, it's not mine.
he says, on this score, on the question of how do we train the mind to think? And can the mind be trained at all? He says, on this question, there exists far from groundless opinion according to which the mind, the ability to think, talent, or simply ability, is from God, God-given, or in more enlightened terminology, it comes from nature. He means genetics. Right? So there are political ideologies out there that say humans are inherently intellectually unequal in certain senses because some people have a God-given ability to be great thinkers and others are not, or some people have superior genetic makeup. Right? So whether you have those theories, he says, I don't subscribe to these theories. Right? So there's a point of difference. Indeed, it is possible to inculcate mind into a person in the form of a system of precisely and rigorously formulated rules. You can define thinking, in other words, to be a mechanically implemented process, right? You give rules, the student will follow those rules, and he or she will solve the trigonometry question.
Sounds like syllogisms.
In a certain way, like syllogisms, yeah. In a certain way, like syllogisms. This is why we don't stay with Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle's syllogisms are not Aristotle's own writing. These are lecture notes that his students wrote down. So they wrote down the results, but we missed 1,000-page descriptions of why he got there and why they presented this way. Yes. Exactly. So he says, okay, but we can call thinking certain mechanistic rules that, like algorithms. You know, what is an algorithm? Algorithm is sort of like a well-ordered, literally, from 1 to 15 steps that if you follow, you will arrive at a certain result. And that's how computers are programmed because that's the nature of the computer. That's how you have to do it. So algorithmic, kind of mechanistic, formalized, mathematically presented way of thinking is necessary if you want to program computers because that's how computers function. There's no other way, right? However, if you want to apply this kind of mechanistic, algorithmic way of problem solving and you want to call that thinking, you're not going to get very good results. And he gives an example. He says, hardly anyone will dispute the fact that the teaching of formal logic, mathematicized logic, introduced into Soviet schools some time ago, quote, on the personal instructions of Comrade Stalin, which is how, okay, so in the Soviet curricula of the early 50s or early 40s, I forget now, Soviet like high school kids learned formal logic, like modern logic, non-dialectical logic.
Yeah.
You know, like Frege, you know, mathematicized logic. And why? Because Comrade Stalin said, logic and cybernetics essentially is going to be the future of our world. So every Soviet kid has to be introduced to formal mathematicized logic early in their education. So of course the Soviet system started teaching logic in that way. And Ilyenkov is saying, okay, we did that, but that did not increase the number of thinking people or reduce the number of stupid people among high school graduates.
Right.
So clearly you can't cheat. You can't say, we're going to call thinking the formal acquisition of received knowledge, and then everything's going to be fine. You're going to have a society of thinking people because it didn't happen. Okay. Now we go to Kant. I just want to read. It is not empirically indisputable experience alone that supports the aforementioned opinion. The most precise and rigorous rules that constitute logic do not and cannot teach the so-called power of judgment. And now he's reference to Kant. That is, the ability to judge whether a given case or a given fact falls under given rules. As Kant wrote in his Critique of Pure Reason, the school can only prefer to, and as it were, graft upon a limited understanding of an abundance of rules. This is very profound insight by Kant on the limits of schooling, if you want to do it mechanistically, borrowed from the insight of others. So there's certain limits, Kant is saying, to what you can understand if you simply borrow from other people's knowledge and memorize it. Why? Because knowledge is vast. So if this represents the entire corpus of American literature, how much can we mechanistically force you to learn and memorize? Well, we can teach you some Shakespeare from, we can teach you some Melville, we can teach you maybe some Toni Morrison, and maybe we can introduce you to some Walt Whitman. But if you don't have your own innate ability to think or to appreciate or to self-motivate and understand the importance and the power and the beauty of Melville, Whitman, and Morrison, then all you're going to have is this initial exposure in high school literature classes to these three thinkers. You would not be exposed to any other great American literature. So what's the effect of that education? Nothing. You're going to forget Shakespeare. You're going to forget the Melville as soon as you graduate from your high school. If you do not have something else in you that will get activated when you get exposed to literature, meaning what else happens in your mind when you read Melville? What else does it make you think about? Well, maybe you go, wait a minute, Melville said this? Wait a minute. Oh, I think he said that because this, and then you connect these other connections are made in the thinking person that then exposes the thinking person into other parts of the received wisdom of the society that you live in. Right? But you can't get there if you don't know how to think. Right? You only become exposed to a limited subset of the received knowledge and wisdom. And Kant is saying that's all you're going to get in school if you structure schooling like a mechanistic exercise of knowledge transmission.
Right, and he is asking a very radical question, Kant in this case, about what are the conditions for the production of that knowledge. It really has to look again at the conditions, just like you were doing with the terms in the syllogism.
Right.
You're always
the
looking
conditions
at
of the terms, yeah.
the conditions of the terms.
Where does this stuff come from? Why does it have to be this way?
Right.
Can we substitute something else? Kind of like you were doing, wrestling with the premise. Like that's the origins of thinking.
Right.
Of course, Kant knew this stuff. We are
Yeah,
in the Critique of Pure Reason. But Ilyenkov is saying in the 1960s, in his society, this lesson is ignored.
Well, it becomes a question, I think, again, what you were just doing with literature is it becomes accumulated knowledge and not dialectical knowledge. And the difference is that most people are unable to really think the tension of the contradictions, to go back to
which
a term that allows them to think, there's something else going on here in Billy Budd than just a guy who's set up by the masters at arms on a ship, and in charge of a setup on a mutiny. There's something much else going on here. Or with Bartleby, there's much else. Most people teach Bartleby, okay, he's lazy, he doesn't want to work, etc. They don't teach it as an anti-capitalist.
This is a great example because think about it, just to follow what you just said. How would you cultivate a love of music, for example, if, as a kid who's exposed to music, you know what music is because you're hearing it. So to you, music is something that you like is something that makes you feel good, for example, or uplifts your spirit, or you listen to it when you're sad. But that's one interpretation of music.
Right.
That's the most concrete kind of, that's the most abstract interpretation of music, Ilyenkov would say, right? But then you learn something else about music. Maybe you learn how music is put together, or how this music is put together. Maybe you're exposed to different kinds of music that you didn't know about. And all of a sudden, but how are you supposed to develop an aesthetic of music, right? You can't do it simply by memorizing, oh, this is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. This is Dizzy Gillespie, this record. This is John Coltrane. This is, Janis Joplin. Yeah, you can memorize Janis Joplin's voice, and you can memorize the lyrics of a Sinatra song, but there's something missing there. You're missing you're missing the thinking. What makes sense to you about Sinatra that you enjoy listening? Well, now you learn about Sinatra. Now you know about Sinatra's life and his politics and the circumstances of this album, and all of a sudden your appreciation of Sinatra is much more layered. You can do the same thing with film. Like you go to the movies and you watch the film and you're like, yes, the good characters won and the bad, evil character lost. And it's like, that's all you got. But there are other, what about how the actresses or the actors, how were they acting? You notice this incredible presence in what she did or what the filmmaker did, what the cinematographer chose. All of these things are not obvious. They have to be cultivated through the interaction of this and this inside your body. But Ilyenkov is not an idealist. This doesn't happen in isolation in your body. This is what he calls historical culture that is inherited by the well-educated, fully formed human being. We internalize the historically developed culture of our society. We understand what to make of it by ourselves, how to interpret it, and that requires both formal acquisition of received knowledge. You have to know, lots of different movies that are important in American cinematography or music or literature or whatever. And you have to process it. And if you do that, you become aware of the culture that you inherit simply by being born in this society. Right? So this becomes a very powerful way of thinking about what socialization is in Ilyenkov's reading. I want to read the quote by Kant that so Kant is saying, the school can only prefer to, and as it were, graft, look at the word, graft, upon the kid, the student, a limited understanding of an abundance of rules borrowed from the inside of others. You're going to get hit with rules, many rules, but you'll understand them in a very limited way.
This is an example of the tenure machine at work. What people do in scholarship, they graft onto something already. There's no thinking that's really going on. It's just a grafting of quote-unquote what you call the acquired received knowledge, and a reproduction of rules and formulas. And this is one of the worst effects of Derridian deconstruction, Foucaultian, historicism, and of course even Lacanian psychoanalysis, where terms are overladen and there's no really thinking going on.
There's no thinking. It's
right?
just a
it's
juggling
almost a kind
of
of mechanical juggling of terms, of which there are codes that are set up, but there's no real tension.
Received wisdom is manipulated.
Right.
Look, you can write I'm sure people have written computer programs that can spit out an academic paper today.
Absolutely.
I can tell you exactly what it begins with. In this article, I will argue, comma.
Right, exactly.
And then you copy and paste sort of your argument.
Right.
So you tell the reader, and then I conclude. So you tell the reader your initial argument, the conclusion, and then there's section 1 methodology.
That's right.
How am I going to get to there? Now there's nothing wrong with this by itself. This is just a technique of writing. But there is something wrong with it. It becomes the only way through which you make sense of the world.
Right. That's right.
Right?
I'll give an example.
Why? Because you write an article, an academic article, where you stitch together formally acquired by yourself, received knowledge, and you do a tiny bit maybe of engagement with the formally acquired pieces of information that you're using, and that's your conclusion. That's the shortest part of your paper, and then you publish it.
Give you an example. I have a friend. he used to date as was, 10, 15 years ago.
It's okay.
The
We
person that's right used to, and she's a professor in literature at the University of Texas at Austin.
Okay, so it's fine.
I'm not going to put any names out. But anyway, they're having a discussion about Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness, and they're discussing the book and everything. And he gets to the point of the discussion where he says, "You remember in the novella where this was said?" "Oh, I never read the novella." She only read the theory around the novella because that was dominant in the curriculum and could have no discussion about the book coming out. Someone who's,
Is well known.
well
in his
known,
career.
actively tenured, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been the misuse of a lot of theoretical, quote unquote, high-powered theory that comes out of France and Germany in the 1960s.
The most
70s,
extreme
80s,
version
and
of this
90s.
I read recently is from Google.
What's that? I'm sorry?
That's great. That's wild.
Yeah, yeah.
Never
It's
read
true.
Heart of Darkness.
Yeah, I never read the book.
But check this.
But I can talk about it from the theory. I have the prism of received knowledge. I mean, I like this very much because it I think opens up some of the real problems we face. I mean, there is no education going on. There's a mechanical reproduction. It's even worse than your diagramming. And as you know, we're
even
we're,
very
we're in
little
the belly
received
of
knowledge
the
is
beast.
acquired
me,
today.
yeah, right.
But I read
Right,
this quote by Google engineer who
Yeah.
said he works. They were working on the Google translation site. Translate.google that translates all the languages. So the writer, it's a book. I think it was a book on Google and big data. So the writer asks, well, how many of your programmers speak Chinese fluently in order to program the algorithms that translates Chinese to English text, right?
It doesn't
He
work,
says,
man.
none of our programmers know any Chinese whatsoever. It's completely unnecessary.
Right. I got killed because I used that once in French. And I wrote to a French friend and,
So in other words, what I just want to say, yes, when you're programming a computer system
Right.
to translate Chinese into English,
Right.
the computer system doesn't need to learn Chinese
Yeah,
in
of
the
course.
human sense. So
Yeah.
that makes sense. They're using a language that's... The problem is, they
tone,
think...
nuance, accentation, all of these things are being mixed.
But the problem is that the programmers were thinking that it's okay for humans to think that way too. That they don't need to know
No, of course not.
anything. They can use something. You don't need to learn something. You can just acquire it from somebody else who already has it. And this is the whole model of Google used as a research platform. Like, I don't need to know anything. I don't need to remember when World War I started. All I have to do is, when did World War I start?
I have another story on that.
And the received knowledge will come into my
You're
computer.
aware of the fact that they're working now on being able to insert knowledge, information by a computer into the brain.
Yeah, and it's like,
Yes.
why?
Yes.
Right?
Well, okay, but you're raising the question why, but it's important to know that that is in fact happening.
It is happening, yeah.
Yeah.
And what does
It's
that mean?
happening.
That means
It's
the
not a pie in the sky. Original work has already been done to do that.
So those people probably think that thinking is an obsolete category of human sort of ability. Like thinking actually means the formal acquisition of received knowledge directly into your brain.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just
This was again, I mean, very interesting. What I know about Ilyenkov and others of the school, that they were very much against Wiener's, cybernetics.
They hated
They really
cybernetics
did
in
not
its
like
application
Wiener's,
to social
the human use of human beings,
circumstances,
of which
yeah.
the entire social science structure in the United States is built on Wiener,
Yeah.
the constructions of the social sciences after World War
And the
II,
Soviets in the
of which
60s did the
Mills-
same
Arguably
thing.
what you're talking about,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
new techno stuff is super
Absolutely.
cybernetic. It's
Absolutely.
cybernetic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ilyenkov actually wrote, I'll send you the link, he wrote a 60-page kind of a satire, which has recently been published in English, translated to English, which is essentially a targeting cybernetics
Right.
and cyberneticians' belief that their derivation of those kinds of formal rules in cybernetics can be seamlessly applied to social interactions,
Right. Space
which
Force.
is terrifying, right? So just to finish the Kant quote before we
I
go.
liked Ron Paul's, you get a conservative. I guess we're borrowing money from the Chinese to pay for the defense budget.
And these
That
absurd
was
things.
it, how absurd this has become. Yeah.
So just to finish that Kant quote, and then we have to go. But The school can only prefer to, as it were, graft upon a limited understanding of an abundance of rules borrowed from inside of others. But the power of rightly employing them must belong to the learner himself. Okay? This is what the school system should cultivate. We need to cultivate, right, the ability, which is a power, to employ the rules and the knowledge that you received on how to manipulate the received knowledge. You have to know how to manipulate the received knowledge by yourself. And in order to do that, you have to understand it. And in the absence of such a natural gift, Kant says, no rule that may be prescribed to a student for this purpose can ensure against misuse. Deficiency in judgment is just what is ordinarily called stupidity, Kant says. And for such a failing, there is no remedy. Okay? Ilyenkov, this seems to be true. And here is the opinion of another thinker, cited with great sympathy by Lenin, as sharp-witted, meaning Hegel. So he's going to quote Hegel now. Concerning the prejudice that logic teaches how to think. So this is Hegel now. Hegel says, if you think that logic teaches how to think, by logic he means not dialectical logic, but mechanical scholastic logic. So Hegel said, you think logic teaches how to think? This is like saying, Hegel says, that only by studying anatomy and physiology do we first learn how to digest food and move. This is indeed a naive prejudice. This is why the introduction of logic as a formal algorithmic system into the secondary school curriculum could not justify the hopes that some people placed on it. Right? So Hegel's saying, what is thinking? Thinking is not learning how to formally do something in certain steps. Right? This is not how we learn how to eat food and digest food. Right? Other rules exist for that. So that's the end of page 2, basically. So please bring this article next time because they're wonderful sections on...
What's hilarious is the money bags.
The money bags
quote
from Marx.
From Capital, if you've read Capital. This is really hilarious.
Just to give you a hint on some of the
Yeah.
things that I sort of highlighted from the next page on. So next he's going to talk about what is intelligence and is it a natural gift or is it a socially acquired skill? He's going to define algorithms. What is the role of social human culture? What is culture, in other words? What emerges out of social interaction? What is the full development of a human being? How can we capture that? What is the definition of it, if you will? What is abstract versus concrete? He'll quote Hegel by saying that the most uneducated people only engage in abstract thought, which is a reversal of how we commonly use that word. Right? And the more educated you are, the more concrete you are in your thinking, Hegel said. And the less educated or aware you are, in other words, the less you can think, the more abstract you are in thinking. Which is kind of a flipping of the way we conventionally talk about this. What is the mind and its distinction from the brain? There's a great description of schooling on page 13, for example. What is stupidity? What is stupidity? Stupidity is the atrophied power of judgment. This is Kant, Hegel, and Ilyenkov. Then he says interesting things about brain functioning from psychology of the 1960s, Soviet psychology, from the notion of the importance of forgetting. On page 14, there are beautiful sections on how the brain, according to Ilyenkov and his friends in the Vygotsky school, we do forget things, and the forgetting mechanism is one of the most important abilities we have. And by forgetting, we know how to think. This is an interesting counterposition to modern society of the datum, where nothing is forgiven, nothing is forgotten. You can just pile everything onto the hard drive. You just have to buy a new hard drive.
Nothing is forgiven, including
And nothing
death,
is forgiven. And nothing is
including all kinds of practices.
It wouldn't be great to forget things
Right.
in order to uncover other ways of
That's
remembering.
Nietzsche, active forgetfulness.
Yeah.
Active
Exactly.
forgetfulness, yes. So all these things, and all of this is introductory in order to get to the most important sections,
Right.
which deal with dialectical logic. When he asks the question, then what do we mean by logic? Logic, of course, is the study of how we think, and then he gets into the Hegelian contradiction, and that's the most important section. Where there are great metaphors, electrical wires that are severed. How do you make the connection and complete the circuit? Okay, so we'll continue with Ilyenkov in January
The
But
22nd and the 29th.
The
right? Is that
22nd and
okay?
the 29th will be the
yeah.
conclusions
Okay.
of this
I'll
class.
send out an email, to that
Can I
effect.
talk you a deal?
Yes. I'm listening.
I'll swap you something for something.
Okay.
You know how to do this, yeah.
You can just stop it.
Yeah, just press the red button.
Okay, yeah,
Is that it?
I think so.